We are going to moderate ourselves here. And of course, I'm the one that can serve as moderator in the sense that I'm the least knowledgeable about this topic. I'm not sure why they put me here. So I'm going to ask first Kaiser and then Ligia. We'll have introductory remarks and then we'll continue the conversation and then we'll go on to questions. So please, Kaiser.
Thank you, Jose.
Yes, please.
Really strikes me how little China has been talked about. Maybe it was in deference to knowing that this session was coming up and that we would save it all up for today. But I really think a long overdue reckoning with China's rise is really upon us now. It's very incumbent that we talk about it. I'm not talking about coming up with a set of policies to address either the economic or even the geopolitical reality, but I sort of, in the spirit of this remarkable group of people that's been assembled here, I'm talking about an intellectual reckoning, maybe even an active imagining of the sort that Omar just talked about. China's rise is not something that is any longer in doubt, or it certainly shouldn't be. Not even so much as something ongoing, but it really is simply a fact of the world that we now must deal with. China may further slow its economic growth. It may struggle with demographic stumbling blocks, deflation. The property sector might still languish. But what it has already accomplished, what it has laid down as foundation for the continuation, the furtherance of human flourishing in that enormous nation, that is not likely to vanish and indeed continues to consolidate. Today, it's become increasingly hard for me to listen to Westerners and especially Americans, to hear them talk about to do that, perform that de rigueur recitation of that litany of Chinese perfidy that somehow must precede anything remotely positive that one says about China. I cannot help but strongly suspect, I think I'm quite certain that in most cases that's just a lot of self-soothing. It's a lot of copium being smoked in great plumes, and we do a lot of that. Now this is both especially obvious to me given the state of the West, as we've been talking about here in the last few days. Also especially forgivable to me in some sense, also given the state of the West, this broken world and the polycrisis that we've been talking about. China, after all, is not at war, has not been at war since, well, really, the days of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, right? China is committed to an energy transition, to its so-called its twin carbon goals of actually peaking carbon emissions by the year 2030 and by achieving carbon net zero by 2060. It's very much on track. In fact, the last 18 months to 24 months, it seems like we have already quite possibly peaked carbon emissions. They have been declining slowly in that period. Meanwhile, this doesn't compare very favorably to drill baby drill coming out of the U.S. administration, or in fact, just the neutering of the Environmental Protection Agency's very ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as the Trump administration overturned its legal foundation, the endangerment finding that you may have read a couple of weeks ago. My patience then, as I think it is with many of you, with Western hubris is quite exhausted, even as I now worry that we will see China go beyond kind of justifiable pride and tip into that same kind of hubris, beyond mere healthy cultural confidence. Still, I mean, in looking at China's rise, we have to acknowledge that every major Western predictive framework, modernization theory, democratic peace theory, the responsible stakeholder model, they have all failed to anticipate or to explain China's rise. The frameworks that misread China then, unfortunately, are still very much shaping our response now, and that should give us pause, as it gives me pause. Above all, we have to be able to confront something, and I feel like this is particularly relevant given the timbre of conversation here in the last couple of days. Something in the Chinese narrative of modernity that is fundamentally at odds with the familiar Western narrative. I would say it's even beyond a Western narrative, but China's story features a fundamentally different configuration of institutions, of values, of priorities. In the Western post-Enlightenment story, the state is something to be restrained. Progress is driven by the dynamism of individuals, of markets, civil society. Modernity is almost synonymous with emancipation from tradition, from the church, from hierarchy, from collective constraint. Indeed, across the last couple of days, as I said, from our opening talk at the Fenestra to the panels yesterday and this morning, the idea of transformation from below, acts of emancipation, bottom-up organization, the mass protest, which has become sort of a fetish object in much of the West. We've heard about this again and again. This contrasts quite starkly from what we've seen in China's story of transformation, and we have to reckon with this. So we need to look pretty boldly and bluntly at a truth that flies in the face of this familiar and often very comforting narrative. In China's case, the state has remained quite central, not merely as a regulator or a guarantor of order, which it certainly has, and has, to recite one of those pieces of the litany of perfidy, done so with extreme prejudice sometimes, but as an active architect of national identity, of destiny. Modernity has been understood not as liberation from authority, and more really as sort of the fulfillment of collective potential through state and specifically party coordination. I want to be careful not to overstate that, not only because there are many obvious features of the emancipatory ideal that have been at work in China's story of modernity as well. I don't want to undersell the extent to which, the revolution, as well as, reform and opening, represented emancipation from certain forms of state control. That is certainly the case. But we are still left with this. The Chinese state sees itself, most Chinese people, I dare say, see the state as a steward of modernity, not as its obstacle. That is part of the reckoning, I think, understanding how China's own path has been so fundamentally different from our own, and how it challenges many of the West's comfortable assumptions. But it's also vital that we see this moment through the eyes of our intellectual counterparts in China. The moment that we are in is one in which I think the critical mass of Chinese intellectuals essentially believe that the problem of modernity has been solved. It's a bold claim. China has found a path to national wealth and power that is consonant with its Chineseness, that resolves, I think, for enough of China's cognoscenti, the tension that has so long bedeviled them. That is, how to create that national wealth and power and resolve what is mine by historical bequeathal, meum, with what is true, as I dispassionately and as I look about me in the world of facts and reality. When these two things are not in alignment, a civilization or a state or a culture is not in harmony. It's not in balance. And it's been this task of alignment. There's been sort of the Chinese intellectuals project, as Pankaj knows really well from his work on Liang Qichao. You're familiar with the work of Joe Levinson from your research from the Ruins of Empire, and I'm sure you know this argument well. But I would submit that this tension has actually been resolved in modern times, and while it bears an inelegant name, and while it is cobbled together from bits and pieces of Confucianism, of Singaporean-style techno-authoritarianism, of straight-up Leninism, of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, it's got all these features and more, and it's a crazy quilt. But it is something that Chinese people recognize as Chinese, and Chinese people recognize now as having worked, as having done the job. So even as they're acutely aware of the crises that beset the world, Chinese intellectuals do not, in general, feel China to be in crisis. It's a very strange feeling to be there and not be confronted with this idea of polycrisis constantly. except talking about the world outside. It has, I think, at least in its own way, answered the great question that has defined modern Chinese history. It feels like it is moving out of the period of modern Chinese history and into something distinctly postmodern, where there will be an entirely different set of questions. I think that it's incumbent on us now, people who work on China especially, to think about that, to understand what is the new question, what is the new set of questions that are driving intellectual life in China. China's rise challenges not just Western power, but Western universalism, the assumption that one nation's path through modernity, that one set of nations, the West, the post-Enlightenment West, that is the one and only path to it. It was bound, I think, in many ways to challenge that assumption, but until our familiar narratives are honestly examined, we're going to keep reaching for frameworks that flatter us and mislead us exactly at the moment when we can least afford it. So I think that this juncture, it's a very, very critical moment where the West is in crisis. China is in many ways feeling its oats. There is this temptation to reach, I think, for what I would call the trap of civilizational thinking. And whether we're talking about the sort of Western values, the sort of neo-Christendom idea of a Rubio or a Hegseth, as Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference was a very, very good example of this, or whether it's Ruski Mir or Hindutva, whether it's China's idea of Tianxia, whether it's the Ummah of the Islamic world, there are all these new civilizational paradigms that I think they tend to emerge in moments of crisis. They tend to attract us when the work that nation state does no longer seems to do the job. It's no longer fit for purpose, and people reach for civilizationalism. It's a trap. Civilizationalism, that thinking does two things. Internally, it enforces monoculture. It wants to erase diversity and impose homogeneity. Outwardly, it may look like a pluralist project. It may claim difference. It may want it may be consonant with the multipolar world that we're moving into. But I think that this idea that we now associate with Samuel Huntington, it feels clarifying, I think, to some, but I think when you're inside that trap, cooperation looks like naivete, friction looks like, confirmation. So what I'd like to see win out instead is my own idea. I mean, it's very much informed by thinking of many important moral philosophers, but what I call priority pluralism. We are, after all, entering now a genuinely multipolar world. It's a way to recognize commonality without either imposed universalism or embracing total moral relativism. These are the two poles that have, neither of them. There's Scylla and Charybdis that I've tried to sail between for pretty much my whole life. Different societies can, in fact, I think they do share quite a number of commitments, the same underlying values that we've been talking about. Security, sure. Health, prosperity, human dignity, sustainability, an end to cruelty. These are, not in a universalist sense, but these are commonly held values. But I think that societies order them differently. It makes sense to me as an American to see civil and political rights held up above all. That is sort of baked into the American political culture. But I think it should not take a major intellectual feat to be able to step out of that, to take the same kind of pluralist thinking that I think is one of the great features of the West, of Western European and North American countries, where we're able to contain within us that most basic level of pluralism, where your metaphysical claims, your epistemic claims, your moral claims that are represented in different religious traditions are allowed to coexist. Why can we not then make a simple leap to say it is okay for another society to decide that, in the sort of keeping with Maslow's hierarchy, that fundamental economic rights maybe should be met as precondition before civil and political rights. Priority pluralism, I think, is a way out of this trap. Hope in a broken world, maybe. I think the most conspicuous source of hope coming out of China, as many people keep coming back to again, is addressing the problem of the climate change. I mean, it's produced manufacturing capabilities and the very central technologies of the green transformation, of decarbonization, solar, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries. I think that is the fix number one, and it's strange how little we have been willing to embrace the possibilities that China offers here. As I was listening to Kohei's excellent intervention yesterday, a few things struck me. China's leaders do not believe in the end of progress. In fact, if you were to read the 15th Five-Year Plan, you'll see that there's still a vision of improved human flourishing, of technological development, of common prosperity. And yes, I hear how this Chinese version of modernity looks a lot like the sort of bland, convergent, global consumerist taste that Nazreen just talked about. I am definitely torn between my own revulsion for it and yes, my own secret lust for those same niceties. And this sort of awareness that this attitude risks its own form of condescending kind of bourgeois nostalgia. This is perhaps the rarest instance of that temptation to reach for, but yes, but. This yes, but thing that we always reach for with China, it's natural. I'm sure many of you are thinking it even now as I'm speaking. I would ask that you resist that urge. Don't self-soothe. Just say no to cope. Look instead for tangible sources of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaiser. You really set us on a good base to begin discussing. You're giving us this complex overview of what China means in our broken world, and it's really there are very aspects of China that really counter many of the arguments we've presented here. Now let's hear another voice from another Chinese voice from London, and see how the Chinese from London sees China. Is more related to the other exiles that we have commented before. So, Ligia.
Exile, self-exile.
Yeah, well,
Good
there are many
morning.
forms of exile. Yes, please.
The rise of China is indeed one of the most astonishing events in the past half century. And I, a rocket factory worker turned writer, have witnessed it all. Perhaps I should share with you my life story, which also reflects China's dramatic transformation. I was born into a poor working class family in Nanjing on the banks of Yangtze River. A good student, I dreamed of going to university and becoming a writer and journalist. But when I was 16, I was pulled out of school and had to start work at the factory my mother worked for all her life. That was 1980, I was 16, so you clever people can quickly work out how old I am precisely. The reason was simple. Our family was very poor. By the time I became a factory worker, I still shared a same bed with my younger brother and my mother. We only had 2 tiny rooms. I didn't mind that so much, but I did mind that we didn't have enough meat to eat. Back then, everything, all the desirable goods, like edible oil, eggs, rice, meat, was rationed. Every month, we were allocated a tiny amount of meat. So to satisfy our craving for meat, my brother and I used to go out and to catch cicadas, the insects buzzing on treetop, and then we would roast them over a bonfire and munch them up. Delicious, I dare you to try. So my mother, being uneducated, I don't think she ever appreciated the value of education, and she thought the most important thing was to secure a job for her daughter, especially a job with a state-owned enterprise. My factory, the first product, the chief product of my factory, was intercontinental missiles that were capable of reaching North America. No fear, please. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't know any top nuclear secrets. I was working on the front line with a very basic job. The task I was assigned to was to test pressure gauge, very simple and repetitive. The factory was very much a mini communist state. The factory provided a lot for us workers, like a housing, like a hospital, shower houses, but it also controlled our life. No lipsticks for women. Men's hair could not exceed earlobes. Kaiser, with long hair like yours, you won't be able to pass the gate. The guards will catch you and send you back home.
I was shooed out of many girls' bathrooms, men's bathrooms. So.
And no dating within 3 years of entering the factory. So just there are so many rules. So I worked at the factory for 10 years, and I always felt I was like a frog being trapped in the bottom of a factory well. So as an escape route, I decided to teach myself English with the hope of getting a job as an interpreter with one of the many factory Western companies that were setting up shops in Nanjing. To start with, I had to borrow a radio from my cousin. We were so poor, we didn't even have a radio. And I followed a program called New Concept English. It's a new concept indeed. Once I started, I began obsessed by this language system, so different from our Chinese characters. And so obsessed, I often found myself riding my bicycle in the dark street of Nanjing, singing carpenter songs. You guys probably think carpenters were a bit naff, not very cool. But for us, the carpenters represented the high culture from the West. That was one of the first Western albums that went on sale in China. So I was riding my bicycle, singing carpenter songs, sing a song. Somebody told me learning English was a good way to learn the language. And slowly, some of my colleagues looked at me up and down and called me a toad who dreamed to eat swan's meat. You know, toad is something very low, crawling on the ground. Swans, something fly high up in the sky. They were laughing at me for dreaming to have something impossible. So slowly, I just didn't care. I began to, after my English improved, I began to listen to the BBC and the VOA, which broadcast real news instead of propaganda. I began to be political, and with our friends, we debated all the time what was China's future, would the Western-style democracy the answer. In 1989, I organized the biggest protest among factory workers. Thinking about 1989, people think about Tiananmen students, and it started in Tiananmen, organized by students, and grew to be a nationwide movement. At that time, I was still working at the factory, and I organized the workers from my factory to go to the street to protest and support the students, because I believed the individual could make a difference. So looking back, learning English changed my life. What I learned was not just the ABC, but the whole cultural package. As a child, China was very poor, very backward, isolated, and look at China now. So my own journey very much reflects what China went through. Today, the country's achievements are extraordinary, and it has lifted some 800 million people out of the poverty and has become the second largest economy in the world. And its high-speed network stretching over 50,000 kilometers. In one of your podcasts, you said 47. That's the often number quoted. And that's the envy of the world. Its space program has reached the other side of the moon. It needs AI, mobile technology, and green energy. Its global influence has expanded dramatically through initiatives such as Belt and Road. So how did China manage to achieve all of this? Well, the Chinese people are very hardworking and enterprising, and its economic miracle began in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping introduced reform and opening up, which opened the country to the markets, private enterprises, and global trade. Sustained by massive infrastructure investment, a vast labor force, high saving, and strong state coordination, China then industrialized, urbanized very rapidly. Materially, China has been transformed. Politically, the trajectory has not headed the direction I and many others hoped. Under Xi, censorship has been tightened, civil society faces strict controls, independent voices have been narrowed, the gender gap has actually widened, and the feminist activism has been curtailed. Many young people simply avoid to talk about politics. If you focus only on those things, it's easy to feel encouraged. But as someone who has grew up in authoritarian China, I have learned to look for signs of hope. On the opening day, I was very touched by Nasrin's comments about her people in Sudan, holding on to hope in the middle of war. From where I stand, I can see that a desire for basic dignity and voices still continue to surface, often in small acts that rarely make the headline. For example, parents challenge arbitrary school rules on WeChat, residents petition local authorities over pollution, land seizure, or forced relocation. Women speak out about sexual harassment despite immense pressure. And so lots of women, they told me they want to take control of their life, for example, resisting pressure from their family as well as the state to get married and have children. So in short, China is a paradox. Is it a threat? For much of the so-called global south, Asia, Africa, Latin America, China is not seen as a threat. It is a trading partner, a lender, an infrastructure builder, a source of demand. Western anxiety about China, however, is not imagined. China is a competitor, but competition is not the same as existential threat. The key question is, can the US, Europe, and China manage competition without sliding into confrontation? I believe they must, because the major challenge of our time, climate change, AI, pandemics, war, do not recognize ideological border. No nation, how powerful, can solve them alone. One of the missions in my life is to be the cultural bridge between China and outside world. I sense that there's a growing fear about China. I can understand why there's such a fear. There's no democracy, there's no transparency. China has issue with human rights. Look at what's happening in Taiwan, in Xinjiang. But I think some of this fear is generated by ignorance. What I'm hoping to do is to help people to understand where China is coming from, where it is heading. I think once you have a better understanding of China, there will be less fear. Personally, there will be more empathy. I began telling you that I was once a factory worker in Nanjing, eating cicadas for meat, learning English by radio. If someone like me can be transformed by contacting with another culture, I think nations can do too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vija. Well, so the question is, what does a village boy from Valdealgorfa, which is about 150 kilometers from here, the last Castilian-speaking village, but we speak half Catalan in the village, so I never felt that the border between Catalonia and Aragon for me was non-existent. The next two villages were Catalan. So I've always didn't take serious the borders that other Spanish Castilians take very seriously. And then I left Spain very young. I was 18 when I left Spain, and I've been out of Spain all my life, ended up in New York. And I feel at home in Ukraine, I feel at home in Germany, I feel at home in the United States, I feel at home. I mean, these are my 4 countries, and I feel at home in Spain. And I guess I feel at home everywhere. So I have a different sense of this notion of exile as the complete loss. For me, exile was very good. I got out of Franco's Spain, and I could study, and I could learn languages, and I could experience the 60s, 69 out of Spain. So anyhow, so what I'm doing here, talking about China, I don't know why Tom put me here. I guess I am the generalist, you know, the jack of all trades, master of none, or as they say, a person so well-rounded that has no point. I'm going to have actually 6 points, and I have written them so that I can be as brief and concise as I can be. Usually I do also have 3 points all the time, but this time I got 6 points. First, and it's a response to the questions that Tom said to us about this threat and what does it mean, and how do you explain this unbelievable, unexpected rise of China. So let me begin with a critical comment about the Eurocentric concept of China's path to modernity. Such a path only began in the middle of the 19th century with the humiliating Western hegemonic colonial treaties. Before that, China had followed its own path. Maybe it's following again. Second, the rise of China is not so astonishing if one takes into account the previous fall of China, linked to colonial domination, well into the end of the 18th century, when the great divergence between China and the West begins economically. Most economic historians would agree that the difference really only begins then. The Middle Kingdom, meant middle, the center of the earth, had been a proud, self-confident empire and the largest economy on earth. Until 1800, the Chinese economy was the largest economy on earth. Sending precious commodities to the West that the West wanted very much, while China didn't want any commodity from the West. The only one was silver. So only silver wanted. And when the British wanted to sell other things, they decided opium will open the way. So the second commodity that China got from the West was opium. And this is the way it was, the markets of China were open to Western trade. The importance of the state. Third point. The Chinese imperial state was a 2,000-year-old state which emerged around the same time as the Roman Empire and has lasted until today. It was a state that from early on had as its task to feed and to educate its population, something which the European states only began to do in the last 200 years. But as an imperial state, it could accommodate all kinds of internal differences and pluralism, such as the Muslim Uyghurs or Tibetan Buddhists, without homogenizing them. So here we come to the question of borders. I also believe in a world without borders, because I'm a Catholic. and this was a different type of universalism. The contemporary pattern of enforced authoritarian homogenization is not a Chinese trait, but one acquired from the European Westphalian system and the globalization of the nation state through Western colonialism. It is the nation state that has borders and cannot accommodate Tibetan Buddhists and Muslim Uyghurs without making them Chinese. Fourth, the Chinese imperial state had no marked history of military expansionism. It pacified the peripheries through cultural and symbolic cooptation into the center. From this perspective, there is no reason to view China's rise as a threat. But I have to admit that for me at least, the fusion of a strong reactive Chinese nationalism, and there's a very strong Chinese nationalism, reactive, and the model of authoritarian control of the ruling Communist Party could turn into a lethal combustion if provoked by the West. There is a noticeable, and here is a particular point which I've always found striking, a noticeable and worrisome affinity between the Confucian ideology of the literati as a ruling imperial elite and that of the ruling Communist Party. It is no coincidence the three East Asian Confucian states, China, North Korea, and Vietnam, have very viable communist states today. Japan also had a very powerful communist movement, as did Indonesia with this large Chinese diaspora. So there is some affinity there, but the question is how it will be used and in which direction. And on the final question, yes, I do believe that not only we can work together towards these common goals, towards this simply working to have a common home on this endangered planet, but we must and we should. And that we must work towards such it will not happen without work. So it is our task to make sure that this imagination happens. For that, the West will need to accept a polycentric model of the globe. Not Western-centric and not even monocentric with peripheries, but a polycentric, what actually our Pope Francis called a polyhedron, one which has myriads of centers and myriads of peripheries all connected with one another. And Western international affairs experts should be aware of the danger, of the trap, of turning their own ideological realpolitik or political realism into a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that if there is a loosening to Chinese nationalism and a loosening of, I think the need of a harmonious state is a model that we can learn from, but one which is really harmonious, not imposed from above, and that really, really, you remember the famous Chinese artist, harmonious was turned into,
Every way said that.
yes, the fact, anyhow, I would like you to now ask questions of each other or comments to each other, and then we'll open the floor for conversation among all of us, please.
I can just make a quick point about
Yes.
the following.
Please, Mike.
Oh, and you talk about China's model of development, you know, it reminds me of the Pankaj book. Many of you probably read From the Ruins of the Empire, and I loved it. And to start with, it's not Eurocentric, but focusing on how Asia thinkers such as Liang Qichao and Tagore, how they reacted to Western dominance or the challenge of the time. So it's for me, it's quite interesting in conversation with my Western friends. Some of them seem to think that as China develops, as China's engagement with the rest of the world deepens, China will automatically become like them, China will become like them. Chinese people will more become like them, but that hasn't happened.
I mean, my model of the encounter is that of Matteo Ricci, right? They became Chinese first. And so, yes.
Yeah, we talk about a little bit about Matteo Ricci, especially with Father Antonio. So Matteo Ricci, for many years, he's been labeled as the biggest cultural invader. But in fact, he was someone who really made a huge contribution to bridge understanding between China and the West.
I really enjoyed both of your remarks, of course. But to Jose, I would caution. I think it's something that historians have to deal with all the time. We look to patterns in antiquity or in the past, and we on the one hand don't want to essentialize. We don't want to believe that these are these timeless, baked-in genetic cultural features. But we recognize continuities too. One point of your 6 points that you raised that it kind of raised my hackles a bit is this idea of China as this eternally peaceful nation. Look, we don't need to invoke that. We don't. First of all, the historical record simply does not support that. The Chinese Empire in its current boundaries was not put together through simply, the Pacific absorption of people from. No, that is simply not the case. It has been very, very bloody, very violent, and has many features of settler colonialism, and we have to be very blunt about that. But we can look to its more recent past, and we see that China simply has not gone to war since the so-called punitive campaign against Vietnam in 1979 to 1980. We can look at the number of military bases and its military actions outside of its borders. We don't need to reach into that. So I would suggest if you are delivering that speech in the future, let's change that one point.
Fair enough. Good.
It is quite interesting because China often stresses, China is a peace-loving nation, and we have never taken territory from outside. It was probably not precisely true. In the Qing dynasty, China expanded quite a lot, right? And it took Xinjiang, Mongolia.
Right. I mean, that of course, that was not arguably that was an invading Manchu Empire that did that. But even if you look at quote unquote China proper, its origins, if you go back, to the beginning of the Chinese state, they're focused on two riparian basins: the North China Plain, the floodplain of the Yellow River, and the Yangtze River Valley. And then everything that expands beyond that, even to modern Shanghai, the area around Shanghai and Zhejiang, and those speak non-Sinitic languages only in 300-400 BC. The states of Wu and Yue spoke non-Sinitic languages. They're much closer to Malayo-Polynesian languages. They were not Chinese in any meaningful sense, and only later became absorbed into China forcefully. Right.
Okay, so would you like to challenge each other, or basically you have no questions to one another?
I'm happy to hear what.
Okay.
How are we managing this?
Please.
Okay, great. And you can pick whose hand you saw first. I think back here.
So we have already Pankaj there, Antonio here.
Thank you, and thank you for this very stimulating conversation. I mean, it occurred to me as you were speaking that this notion that we are working with at this conference, the broken world, discussion of China really complicates it, because the subjective perception of a broken world, which is shared by obviously a lot of people around the world, but it is not the one that is dominant within China today. For many Chinese, the broken world was the world in which the Civil War happened, in which the Japanese invasion happened, in which the chaos and confusion and the violence of the Cultural Revolution happened. Since the late 1970s or 80s, that broken world has been slowly healed for many Chinese, materially, in all kinds of ways. Yeah, definitely not politically, but I think that has been compensated more than adequately by material improvements in the quality of life. So it's a, and even I think what Mohsen said yesterday about the future being unevenly distributed. I think again, I mean, the Chinese Revolution, starting in the early 20th century, has forged a different kind of future, one that is in a way breaking away from the rest of the world. I think my question really is, and in last days of March 2026, what we are looking at globally is an increasing appreciation for what China is, what China has done, especially in climate, coming up with green technologies, confronting the biggest, the most extraordinary, the most traumatic change of our times effectively. And also, I think by default, by not engaging in reckless wars that kill, displace millions of people, by default, China has emerged as a very peaceful alternative to American hegemony, and this is borne out in one opinion poll after another. I mean, just really striking how even in Western Europe, the sort of position or the regard for China has gone up substantially in just the last few months. But I wonder, I mean, given my own experience of the Chinese intellectual sphere, to what extent is this what I would call catastrophic success of China? To what extent are the Chinese prepared for it? To what extent are they prepared to acknowledge both the fact of the success and also to deal with it with the requisite modesty and humility that they ought to deal with it, and to define a world order in which there is certainly less violence, less disorder? To what extent are they prepared to assume this responsibility? I think those are the questions we should now start asking, given that China has won the PR battle, almost by default, because the people, the so-called rivals of China, have flopped so miserably and so visibly that they will not regain credibility for a very long time. American power and prestige lies ruined today, and it won't be recovered for decades now. So what does China offer to the world? And is it equipped to offer? Is it equipped to engage with the world?
So you asked the questions that Chinese intellectuals are asking themselves. I had the pleasure of spending about 5 months of last year living in Beijing again, where I had lived for 20 years between 96 and 2016. I was coming back to China in this sort of a China that has recovered largely from the trauma of COVID, and really trying to engage with as many people in these sort of thinking and strategic class as I can, and sitting down with them and asking them these very same questions. I come away with a few distinct impressions. One is there is a distinct reticence to take much credit. This problem of an intellectual reckoning is not only a problem of the Western intelligentsia, it's also a problem of the Chinese intelligentsia. They're not aware of the full play of this moment, at least the way that I see it. I think that's a good thing. I think that what that shows is a certain kind of humility. In fact, I'm constantly warned by them. They warn of one another because they assume that everyone else is going to succumb to this kind of hubris. They warn against it constantly. They say that is the great deal. They're aware that a lot of this vibe shift on China that they've seen in the West, and they're aware of that. They see what people are saying. They're very alive to it. They're aware that a lot of that has been simply won by default, just by the absolute just fecklessness of American, especially power, and so they don't claim as much credit for it as perhaps they might or even should. So I see so far a modesty that's reflected in the sort of geostrategic, geopolitical ambitions of China as well. Where I think I worry, where I think there are gigantic blind spots, are they are also very in love with this story that China has shown an alternative path to modernity. But I don't think they're aware of the extent to which China has foreclosed that very path to other developing states of the global South, the global majority. I love that phrase. Who used that phrase? The rest of the global majority has that path foreclosed to them because the old flying geese model of shedding, that as the Asian developing countries would sort of shed low value add industries, and those would take root in Cambodia or in Bangladesh. That's not happening from China, in part because China contains many Bangladeshs and Cambodias within its own geography. And so we're seeing a lot of move to the hinterland, but mainly because of automation. So the fabled $6 toaster, which one country, say a developing state of South or Southeast Asia, might aspire to develop, they're never going to be able to beat the Chinese price and quality. They're never going to be able to partake in that same export-led growth. There's a certain blindness to this. There's this sense that the rest of the world is glut-shaming China for its overcapacity, and that they're very defensive about that. And I think there's also maybe a naivete about this peaceful rise idea, that they are, many of them, very, very unaware of some of the dust-ups that have happened, like in Ladakh a few years ago, or in the summer of 2022, I think it was. I'm not clear on on the Indian border. A lot of them are still very, very unaware of how the world views China, and that matters.
Would you like to add something?
So within China, many Chinese, we're talking about the trade war between China and the United States. Certainly lots of majority of Chinese people believe they have won. I want to go back a little bit, talking about how Chinese government, I think, is actually more adaptable, more resilient than many people give them credit for. I mentioned 1989, the unprecedented protest. That happened not only because ordinary Chinese people wanted democracy, wanted greater human rights, but also they were not happy with their lives. There was very little personal freedom. So I saw 1989 was very much a watershed. So ever since then, the 1989 in China remains to be a taboo, and children do not learn at school what happened in 1989. But that does not mean that the Chinese government hasn't thought about that very carefully. So ever since then, on one hand, they granted people a lot more personal freedom. People can move from one place to another. The control over private life being relaxed. Business people, you can even join the party. But on the other hand, they also tightened the political control. So many dissidents being locked up and NGOs being shut down. So so I think there's kind of a contract. You enjoy the freedom, personal freedom, enjoy the opportunity to make business, do not make political demands. And meanwhile, the government provide, stability, economic growth. But when there's a fine line, for example, as we saw that during COVID, China introduced a really incredible, tough control. And then after that fire in Urumqi, where many people, dozens of people died because they couldn't get out of the compound. And that just triggered so much anger. So many people went to the street to protest. So Chinese people are not so totally passive. So when things like that, they are still willing to go to the street to protest. So the government, in some ways, have to found a way to listen to the people.
I think Li Jiang is absolutely right about the responsiveness in that sense. But I think one piece of it that we need to understand is the extent to which the Chinese state engages in unprecedented levels of sentiment monitoring. We think about this apparatus of surveillance and censorship. It's a double-edged thing. They're very tuned into popular discourse, subaltern discourse. They're very tuned into what's happening, and they're very proactive about trying to address what they see as the formation of problems before they become actual street protests and problems. And you can really see that in the reduction of actual street protests that aren't met with any coercive force, but are actually met preemptively with, often with compromise and with addressing the real problems. It's an impressive apparatus.
So, Antonio, please.
Thank you to both of you for what you said. I have a more cultural remark to do, a question to put. Of course, Ligia, you quoted Limadu, Matteo Ricci, who came from Macerata, from Italy to China at the end of 16th century. And for many, this was the first encounter between the Chinese culture and Christianity, which is not at all, because the very first monks, Christian monks, arrived, in Nestorians, so-called Nestorians, came to China around the 7th century, between 7th and 9th century. And I was fascinated because I read the Christian hymns they wrote at those times, and in translation, of course. Unfortunately, I can't read Chinese. Yes. But I was struck because even if I read them in English and in Italian as well, they are translated, I realized that I didn't understand almost anything because what happened? They crossed the Silk Road, and so they met other monks and they asked them for language, how to express Christian culture, Christian theology, the Trinity, for example, in that language. And of course, they learned from Taoist monks or Buddhist monks how to express their own ideas. So there was a deep inculturation in those hymns. So my question is that when we talk about China, I was in China 3 times. I even gave a talk to the Academy for Social Science. I'm a priest, which is pretty weird to have been asked to give a talk to them. But even staying with them and reflecting on this topic, I realized that we think China in Western categories. So we don't pay attention that in China there is a different vision of the world. For example, we have, even when we speak about artificial intelligence, I had a seminar with Chinese people and American and European people. I realized at some point that we weren't talking about the same topic because the philosophy behind the interpretation of the AI was different. Just even because we have a creational way of thinking. So we believe, we can be believer, not believer, but we believe in a creatio ex nihilo, a creation from nothing. But if you're a Taoist, you have a completely different way of seeing things. And so even the relationship with matter and even with technology changes completely. So my question is that even Xi Jinping, for example, he is asking for a Sinicization of Catholicism, of religions in general, but is stressing this point with Catholicism, which is interpreted as a political move, which is true. But at the same time, it's a huge cultural challenge, because since the time of the first evangelization, we understand the gospel in Greek terms or Latin terms. But after this first enculturation, the gospel have been spread around the world in Greek categories, but everywhere: Europe, Latin America, North America, Africa, but not in China. So I feel this, I feel a push to rethink Christianity from a different point of view. We need to learn different categories for seeing the world. Even Pope Francis, I remember when we get back from Bangladesh, he received a question about China. And he gave this answer: when we see the world from China, the landscape changes. Well, I was very struck by that.
Right.
So if you see things, we cannot understand China always using our categories and dynamics, even political ones. So does it mean, which might be the contribution of the Chinese philosophy, Taoism, not just Confucianism? Buddhism, yes. But for example, it's interesting, I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but the Indian Buddhism is completely different from the Chinese Buddhist. So the Buddhism was Sinicized already.
Yeah.
So which is the contribution of China from a cultural point of view, at the categorical, philosophical level of our understanding of our world?
To force us to accept different metaphysics and different anthropologies, conceptions of the self, conception, and accept this pluralism. That, I mean, I will let you from the Chinese perspective. There is a sociologist, Roland Robertson, that defines globalization as the universalization of the particular and the particularization of the universal. The recognition there are many universalisms which simply talk different languages. The Jesuits, of course, were confronted with the problem of reincarnation, a notion of the self that radically changes all conceptions of, what is morality was. And they, of course, they never argue in theological terms, saying this is what the Bible, they argued in Greek philosophical terms. And they believed that these Greek philosophical terms are self-understandingly rational, while this other thing was non-rational. And for the Chinese, they were never convinced, or the Indians were never convinced, of course. So it is the acceptance of these basic different metaphysical presumptions about the cosmos, and also anthropological conceptions of who we are as persons, as selves. And with this, I will let you say your...
Or epistemic.
Right, epistemic, yes.
I think you've touched on something fantastically interesting here, and we stand right now at another juncture that's analogous to the rights controversy.
Yes.
Which, of course, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Jesuits, people like Matteo Ricci, who came to China in the early 17th century, made significant inroads, especially in the elite. They understood that the people that they needed to convert to Catholicism were the Confucian literati themselves. And so people like Ricci learned to be Confucian literati. He dressed as what? He learned calligraphy. He learned the Confucian canon extraordinarily well. It's so admirable. But he also, and the Jesuits encouraged this, wanted to allow Confucian ancestor rites to be accepted as Orthodox Christian practice, to allow this, to be tolerant of this, where the Benedictines and the Franciscans opposed him in this.
Dominicans.
Opposed them.
Dominicans.
The Dominicans, I'm sorry, right. I don't know where the Franciscans were on this, but...
Both Franciscan and Dominicans,
Okay.
but Dominicans were the most.
All right. And of course...
But Paris, the Sorbonne, is not only the church. Paris, the Sorbonne, very clearly attacked the Jesuits. So
Yeah,
it was the whole philosophical West that said these Jesuits compromise our universalism.
That's right. So, I mean, I think in this push to synthesize, there's another opportunity right now to accept that. And I don't think it's a particularly onerous thing that we're talking about. China has a deep syncretic tradition, right, where it was entirely possible. There wasn't a blistering cognitive dissonance for somebody to claim to be a Confucian and a Taoist and a Buddhist, even though, in a strict sense, the truth claims made by each of these might exclude the truth claims of the others, but they never felt forced to reconcile these things. It's interesting that you talk about how it was in the language of especially Confucianism and Taoism, that early Christian teachings were introduced. So too with Buddhism when it entered China. It was explained largely in Taoist terms, so that Buddhism was seen simply as some sort of aberrant offshoot of Taoism. There is a tendency to want to see things just simply as, well, this is just a slightly different variant of something that we're already familiar with. I would say, if I were to advise the Pope today, is lean into that. Lean into the Chinese syncretic tendency. Don't try to resolve contradiction, and I think that you'll move from 100,000, 100 million today to many more Christian converts.
Pentecostals are doing very well in China.
Yeah, but we don't like that.
I know.
You know, until recently, at the Beitang Cathedral near my home in Beijing, there was still Latin Mass in the morning. It was.
You raised a very important question. The Chinese intellectuals have been discussed for so long, since the May 4th movement in 1919. So that's kind of a beginning of China's modernity. People have been debating how to maintain the Chinese cultural essence. Meanwhile, I think they want to open-minded learning modern science and technology from the West. Chen Mao also said, Yang Wei Zhong Yong, right? So kind of learning the Western technology and maintaining. And I think, yes, you know, Chinese, Deng Xiaoping also said, crossing the river by feeling the stone. When the reform started, yeah. So yeah, yes, pragmatic indeed. Yeah, you know, for example, what's happening now in China is such a mixed bag. You know, politically, the government still have the power. Long hand, the government still everywhere. There's a market economy, but to a certain degree, all the important industry is still at the hands of the government. So that's all. So I think they're all kind of like a Confucius. I think that should shut up.
So we have time for two quick questions. I think. Why don't we gather the three questions that we have here? Three, gather them, and then you're the last.
Okay, I'll toss mine out. You know, we hear a lot about the relationship of the West and China, and if China is ascendant, what will happen to the West, etc. I'm very curious about if the Chinese imagining of China's position in the world in, let's say, the middle of this century comes to pass. How in China is the relationship with the countries of the global South sort of considered? So I sit in Pakistan, and there's a sort of quite a friendly relationship towards China. There's not really much fear of China's rise, but there's also not much understanding as to what it would mean, once China has risen. I'm very curious from a Chinese standpoint how this is conceptualized, how it's thought of. If China were to become, in a sense, the linchpin of the global economy, what is the relationship to the other countries of the global South look like in the Chinese imagination?
Okay, please, here. Okay.
Yeah, my question is about the views not of Chinese establishment intellectuals, but more among the young Chinese, because me, more or less as a young person, all the ideas that I see are like a very kind of strong counter culture against a strong competition that exists in the education system, and nowadays when I speak with a lot of Chinese young people, they have a very strong opinion against, especially with the paper movement in Shanghai. They have a very vivid, strong memory that they relate all their struggles that are especially material with also the government, right? And I don't know if especially what happened during COVID in Shanghai in the lockdown, there was really a generational change, or that with the following rise and the following decades or years, this will lay down or not happen at all.
Very brief, please.
Kazi, you said that Chinese leaders don't believe in the end of progress. And so in this context, I'm curious, is progress here strictly defined by sort of GDP and technological milestones, or do they see it as a sort of trajectory towards a more specific kind of social or kind of like moral destination?
Okay, so 1 minute each of you to answer the 3 questions.
Okay, so let me start with the Global South one. I think that China is very keenly aware that it has benefited by the West's colonial overhang, that it knows that it has benefited simply by not having participated in that. And I think that the more enlightened among people who oversee China's engagement with the Global South understand that one of the ways to avoid that is to avoid too much simple entanglement. They want to keep the relationship actually quite transactional, very much based on we're here, we're happy to do business with you, but let's not complicate this with too much. So China is not a country that builds alliance systems. They want your vote in the UN system, but they don't want to go too far beyond that. We talked about this yesterday, about that kind of seeming lack of interest in engaging more deeply in the societies of these countries in which Chinese are present. I think that Chinese see that as a feature and not a bug. To your question about young people, we've seen this revolt against 996, against about this lying flat movement, the kind of quiet quitting version, Chinese style. We've seen this whole discourse on involution, 内卷, this idea. Very much with young people, there is this desire to quit the rat race, to opt out. I actually think that I love this because it feels to me like exhalation, finally, that a little bit of relaxation in the conditions under which some cultural effervescence might finally come, which has been suppressed for a very long time. I think there's a lot of trauma from the COVID lockdowns in Shanghai. It's a very different conversation you have with people in Shanghai versus people in other cities that didn't experience it so badly. That's my quick and then finally, to Gavin, your question, it is a more comprehensive vision. It's one that I think one way to understand it is it's sort of the UN development goals. They really believe in this broad spectrum of human flourishing. So progress means actually longer life expectancy, even things that would maybe surprise you. They want better gender representation, or at least equal pay. They are pushing for elements that they recognize as tolerant. I mean, as progressive, as in like more tolerance, more sort of cosmopolitanism. And it's not a vision that I think anyone who engages with it in good faith would find to be objectionable. And there are elements of it that you might, but...
I saw the sign we should wrap up. Just answer your Mosin's question about China's relationship with the Global South. It just happened that I was traveling for 7 weeks in South America. And China's relationship with those countries, China's presence in South America is increasingly visible. You arrive in, you will see Chinese banks, and there are lots of infrastructure projects. So it's very, very pragmatic. In South America, Americans' backyard, and China's, the influence is, there's tug of war between China and the US. But China's approach is very pragmatic, and they don't care about regime change. They don't give a toss about human rights abuse. And they don't want to force your country to become more democratic. I think some country probably appreciate that. Just, China lends money and buys a huge amount of beef. And minimal, pragmatic.
Well, on this note, let's thank both of you for coming to our meeting, to joining us, and for this fantastic conversation. Thank you, and thank you, all of you.